Welcome back, everyone. We're diving deep into something really important today. We're talking about fair assessments in physical education.
Interesting.
And to help us out, we've got these excerpts from a study guide for the Physical Education CSET 2 exam.
Ah, the CSET.
Yeah. And one thing that really jumped out at me from this material was this idea that assessing PE fairly can actually be way tougher than assessing those traditional classroom subjects.
It's true. It is.
So I'm really curious to unpack that. Why exactly is it so tricky? What makes a PE assessment fair in the first place?
Well, think about it, right? We're not just dealing with pen and paper tests here. There are so many factors at play when you're evaluating physical skills.
Yeah, you're dealing with different abilities, different experience levels, large groups of kids all moving around at once.
Exactly. And, safety is a huge concern, too. We've got to keep everyone safe while they're moving around and trying new things.
Okay, so it's definitely more complex than it might seem at first glance. So let's get back to that question of fairness. What are we actually aiming for when we're creating assessments in PE?
Well, our source material breaks it down into these four key elements: validity, reliability, clarity, and freedom from bias.
Okay, so those are like the cornerstones of fairness.
I'd say so. They're the foundation of any good assessment, really.
All right, I'm ready to break those down one by one. Let's start with validity. What does that actually mean when we're talking about PE?
So validity is all about whether your assessment is actually measuring what it's supposed to be measuring.
Okay, so making sure it aligns with the learning objectives.
Exactly. You want to be sure you're testing that specific skill or knowledge that you've been teaching and not getting sidetracked by other things.
So let's say I'm teaching kids how to shoot a basketball. My evaluation shouldn't also accidentally be testing their dribbling skills.
You got it. That's a great example. You want to be sure you're isolating the skill you're actually trying to evaluate.
And I guess that idea of isolating skills applies even to seemingly simple things, right?
Oh, absolutely. Take dribbling, for example. Seems straightforward, right? But you know what? There are actually a ton of sub-skills involved in dribbling that you'd want to assess to make it a truly valid test.
I guess I never really thought about it like that before. Like, what kinds of things?
Well, think about hand-eye coordination, ball control, maintaining speed, using your peripheral vision. It's more than just bouncing the ball.
That's really interesting. It's like peeling back the layers of a seemingly simple skill. Okay, so we've got validity. What about reliability? How does that fit into the picture?
So reliability is all about consistency.
So getting consistent results.
Exactly. Imagine if a student took the same fitness test twice, under pretty much the same conditions, but got totally different scores. That could mean there's a problem with the test's reliability.
Makes sense. Like if a scale gave you wildly different weights every time you stepped on it, you wouldn't trust it.
Right. You wouldn't be able to rely on it to give you accurate information. And unreliable assessments, they don't just confuse things. They can also be really unfair to students. Because you might not be getting a true picture of what they can actually do.
Okay, reliability makes sense. So what about clarity? That one seems pretty straightforward.
Yeah, on the surface it does. But clarity goes beyond just avoiding jargon. It's about making sure the instructions are clear and easy to understand for everyone, especially for students.
So using age-appropriate language, being really specific about the expectations.
Exactly. It's about creating a level playing field so students aren't tripped up by the wording or format of the assessment.
It's like that example from the source material of the word problem about an airport being confusing for a student who's never even seen one.
Yeah, exactly. They might understand the math, but they're thrown off by the context.
So it's about removing those unnecessary obstacles that prevent them from showing what they know.
Precisely. And it's something we should always be thinking about when we're designing assessments, not just in PE, but in any subject.
Great point. Okay, we've got validity, reliability, clarity. So what's the last piece of the fairness puzzle?
All right, so the final element, and it's a big one, is freedom from bias.
Okay, bias. This is something we hear a lot about these days, but how does it show up in PE assessments specifically?
Well, bias can sneak in all sorts of ways. It's about making sure that the assessment doesn't disadvantage any student because of their background, culture, gender, socioeconomic status, or anything like that.
So, for example, if I included a question about skiing on a fitness test, that would be unfair to students who haven't grown up around snow, right?
Exactly. That's a great example. That question would be biased against students who don't have access to skiing or those who've never even seen snow.
It wouldn't be a true reflection of their fitness level, just their exposure to a specific activity.
Right. And, bias can be really subtle sometimes, but it can have a huge impact on the results. And that's why it's so important to be really aware of it when we're creating assessments.
So to sum it up, if we want our assessments to be fair, we need to make sure they're valid, reliable, clear, and free from bias.
Absolutely. Those are the 4 pillars of assessment fairness.
Okay, those 4 elements make a lot of sense, but I'm curious, what does this actually look like in action? What kinds of assessments do PE teachers actually use in the real world?
Well, there are actually a bunch of different types, but we can break them down into 2 main categories. You've got formative assessments and summative assessments.
Okay, I've heard those terms before, but I'll admit, I could use a refresher. What's the difference between the two?
Sure. So think of it this way. Formative assessments happen during the learning process itself. They're like these little checkpoints along the way.
So like little snapshots to see how things are going.
Yeah, exactly. They help you as the teacher and also the students themselves understand what's working and where they might need a little extra help.
So it's not about grades at this point, right?
No, not really. It's more about using the information you gather from the formative assessments to shape your teaching and help your students learn more effectively.
Oh, that's interesting. So it's like assessment as a tool for improvement.
You got it. And, formative assessments can take a ton of different forms.
Like what? Give me an example.
Okay, so let's say you're teaching a kid how to throw a frisbee.
Okay, frisbee. Got it.
Just observing their grip and their release during practice, that's actually a form of formative assessment.
Really? Just watching them.
Yeah, you're watching, you're gathering information, and then you can use that to give them feedback right there on the spot and help them improve.
That's a great example. Makes so much more sense to give feedback throughout the process rather than waiting till the very end.
Exactly. Catch those little things early on before they turn into bigger problems later. Now, on the other hand, you have summative assessments.
So are those more like the big tests that we usually think of?
You could say that. Summative assessments. Those are all about measuring what a student has learned at a specific point in time, usually at the end of a unit or a course.
So it's like a final evaluation to see what they've mastered.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. They give you a bigger picture of what the student knows and can do.
So in PE, that could be like skills tests or fitness logs or maybe even some kind of big project where they get to show off what they've learned.
You nailed it. Those are all great examples of summative assessments.
Okay, so we've got formative assessments happening along the way and then summative assessments at the end to wrap things up.
That's the basic idea.
But how do we actually make sense of all that information? How do we measure student performance in a meaningful way?
That's where those reference systems come in. They provide a framework for interpreting those assessment results.
Okay, remind me what those reference systems are again.
Sure. Our source material talks about 3 main types: criterion referenced, norm referenced, and then you've got ipsative referenced.
All right, let's break those down. What's a criterion referenced assessment?
So with a criterion referenced assessment, you're comparing a student's performance against a preset standard or goal.
Okay, so it's not about how they compare to other students.
Not really, no. It's about whether they meet that specific benchmark.
Okay, so like if the criterion is for everyone to be able to run a mile in under 10 minutes.
Exactly. You're not concerned about who's the fastest. It's just about whether each individual can meet that standard.
That makes sense. So it's like aiming for a target. Everyone has the potential to hit it.
Precisely. It's a great way to measure individual progress and track how students are improving over time.
Okay, that's criterion referenced. What about norm referenced assessments?
So with norm referenced assessments, it's all about comparison.
Okay, so now we're looking at how students stack up against each other.
You got it. You're comparing their performance to the performance of other students who took the same assessment.
So like ranking them from highest to lowest score.
Or seeing where they fall on a percentile scale.
Right. Makes sense. But isn't there a risk with that? Like, couldn't it make some kids feel bad if they're always being compared to others?
That's a really good point. Norm-referenced assessments can create a lot of pressure and competition. And even if a student is improving, they might still feel like they're falling behind if their classmates are improving even faster.
It's like a moving target. You're always chasing someone else.
Yeah, exactly. And sometimes that can really undermine a student's confidence and motivation.
Yeah, I can see that. It's important to keep that in mind. So what about that last one, ipsative referenced assessments?
Ipsative assessments, those are all about self-improvement. It's about comparing a student's current performance to their own past performance.
Oh, interesting. So it's not about how they stack up against others. It's about how they're doing compared to themselves.
Exactly. It's all about celebrating personal bests and recognizing individual growth.
So if a student runs a mile in 12 minutes 1 month and 11 minutes the next month, that's progress, even if they're not the fastest runner in the class.
Exactly. It's about focusing on their own journey and their own improvement.
I really like that. That seems like a really positive and encouraging approach. Okay, so we've got those three reference systems, but I'm also really curious about two specific assessments that were mentioned in the material about it: the Fitnessgram and the Presidential Youth Fitness Program. Can you tell me a little bit about those?
Sure. So the Fitnessgram, that's a super common assessment that's used to measure youth fitness levels.
Like a standardized test for
You
fitness.
could say that. It's criterion referenced, meaning that it has set standards for different age groups and genders.
Okay, so it's not about comparing kids to each other, but about seeing if they meet those specific health-related benchmarks.
That's exactly right. And it looks at a bunch of different areas like aerobic capacity, muscular strength and endurance, flexibility, and body composition.
Oh, wow, that's pretty comprehensive. And what about the Presidential Youth Fitness Program? Is that similar?
It's actually evolved quite a bit over the years.
Yeah.
It used to be much more focused on athletic ability, which could be kind of intimidating for some kids.
I can see how that could be a problem.
Yeah. But now, the Presidential Youth Fitness Program, it's shifted gears to focus more on providing personalized information about each student's health and fitness levels.
So it's less about competition and more about giving kids a better understanding of their own bodies and how to stay healthy.
Precisely. It's about encouraging them to develop healthy habits that will last a lifetime.
I love that. That's such a positive shift. Okay, so let's say we've done all these assessments, we've gathered all this data. Now what? How do we actually share that information with everyone who needs to know?
Well, communication is key. You've got to clearly communicate those results to all the different stakeholders.
Who are the stakeholders in this case?
Well, you've got administrators, colleagues, parents, and of course, most importantly, the students themselves.
Right, of course. But what kind of information should we be sharing with them?
So the source material gives this really useful framework. You've got to communicate 5 key things: what was assessed, why it was assessed, how it was assessed, what the results were, and then what those results actually mean.
So it's not just about giving them a number or grade, it's about providing context and interpretation.
Exactly. It's about making sure everyone understands the big picture. Why we did the assessment, how we did it, and what it tells us about the student's learning and development.
And I guess that transparency helps build trust and ensure that everyone's on the same page.
Absolutely. And that's so important for student success. Now, before we move on, I really want to emphasize something important here. PE is about so much more than just the physical stuff.
I was just thinking that. There's so much more to it than just running around and playing games.
Right. We need to consider all those other learning domains that are at play in PE, like the cognitive, the affective, the social emotional, all that stuff matters too.
Okay, I'm totally on board with that. Can you tell me a bit more about those other domains and how they show up in a PE setting?
Well, first, let's start with the cognitive domain.
Okay, so the cognitive domain, that's all about thinking skills and knowledge, right? How does that play a role in PE? I wouldn't necessarily associate PE with traditional academic learning.
I know what you mean. But the cognitive domain is actually super important in PE. Think about it. Students need to understand the rules of games. They need to learn strategies, techniques, and there's the whole problem-solving element that comes into play during a game.
So, like figuring out how to outmaneuver an opponent in soccer or learning the different plays in basketball.
Exactly. They're using their brains as much as their bodies.
That makes so much sense. PE really is a holistic experience. Okay, so we've got cognitive. What about psychomotor? That one seems like a natural fit for PE.
Absolutely. The psychomotor domain, that's all about movement and coordination. Those fundamental motor skills: running, jumping, throwing, catching, striking. It's about developing those skills to a level where they can move efficiently and effectively.
So basically all the physical skills we typically think of when we think about PE.
You got it. And yet,
Yeah.
there's a lot of nuance to it. It's not just about being able to do these things, but about refining those movements, improving speed, accuracy, and technique.
Makes sense. Okay, what about the affective domain? This one seems a bit more complex.
The affective domain, it's all about a student's feelings, their values, their attitudes towards physical activity.
So things like sportsmanship, teamwork, resilience, self-confidence, and enjoying movement itself.
You nailed it. It's about fostering a positive relationship with physical activity and developing those social and emotional skills that are so important both on and off the field.
I love that. It's about nurturing the whole child, not just their physical skills.
Exactly. And, we can't forget about the physical domain either. It's about paying attention to those physical changes that students go through as they grow and develop.
Right. So we need to consider their height, weight, muscle mass, and make sure the activities we're choosing are appropriate for their physical maturity level.
Precisely. And we can't assume that every student is at the same level. Everyone develops at their own pace.
Okay, that makes sense. And last but not least, we have the social-emotional domain.
Right, and this is a big one. It's about developing social skills, emotional regulation, building healthy relationships with others.
So in a PE class, that could look like cooperation, communication, empathy, conflict resolution, respect.
Exactly, all those crucial social skills that help kids thrive in all areas of their lives.
Wow, this is so interesting. I'm starting to see how all these different domains work together to create this really well-rounded PE experience. It's about so much more than just physical activity.
Absolutely. It's about developing the whole child, mind, body, and spirit.
Okay, so much great stuff covered already. And it's really making me think about how important it is to assess students fairly in PE, especially with all these different domains involved.
I agree. It's a lot to consider, but it's so important to get it right.
It is. So where do we go from here? What other aspects of assessment should we be thinking about?
Well, one thing that really stood out to me from the material is the idea of making assessments student-centered.
Student-centered. That's an interesting concept. What does that actually mean?
Well, it's about making sure that the assessments are really relevant and meaningful to the individual student. It's about meeting them where they are and helping them grow.
So it's not about forcing everyone into the same box?
Exactly. It's about recognizing that every student is unique
Yeah.
and has different strengths and challenges.
So how do we actually make assessments more student-centered in PE? What does that look like in practice? Tell me more.
I'm happy to. It all starts with really understanding your students as individuals.
Okay, so getting to know them beyond just their athletic abilities.
Right. What are their interests? What are their goals? What are their strengths and challenges? You need to go beyond just the test scores and really get to know them as people.
So that would involve observing them in class, having conversations with them, maybe even doing informal check-ins to see how they're feeling and what they're thinking.
Exactly. And then you can use all that information to design assessments that are truly relevant and engaging for them.
It's about making sure those assessments are aligned with each student's learning goals and giving them opportunities to show their understanding in ways that make sense for them.
Absolutely. And providing feedback that is specific, actionable, and empowering. We want them to feel like they're active participants in the process, not just passive recipients of grades.
I love that. It's about shifting the focus from just evaluating performance to really promoting learning and growth, helping each student reach their full potential.
Precisely. And, speaking of challenges, you mentioned earlier that you were surprised to learn that PE assessments can be tougher to conduct than assessments in traditional classroom settings. Can we unpack that a bit more? I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I really was surprised by that. I think a lot of people assume that PE is all fun and games, but when it comes to assessment, there's actually a lot to consider.
Right. And we've already talked about some of those challenges, the large class sizes, the diverse skill levels, the safety concerns. But there's even more to it than that. Well, think about the sheer variety of skills and knowledge that we're trying to assess in PE. It's not just about knowing facts or solving problems on paper. It's about movement, coordination, strategy, teamwork, communication. There's a lot going on.
It's like you're assessing the whole child in motion. It definitely makes you appreciate the expertise and careful planning that goes into creating fair and effective PE assessments.
Absolutely. It's a really specialized skill set. And, speaking of different aspects of learning, let's shift gears for a minute and dive a bit deeper into those learning domains that influence PE. We touched on them earlier, but I think it would be helpful to explore them in more detail.
Yes, let's do that. I'm really curious to see how they play out in a real PE lesson or activity.
All right, let's imagine you're teaching a volleyball unit. In the cognitive domain, your students are learning the rules of volleyball, different serving techniques, and strategies for passing, setting, and hitting. They're using their brains to grasp the concepts and tactics of the game.
Right, so there's a lot of intellectual understanding involved, even in a sport like volleyball.
Exactly. It's not just about hitting the ball over the net. There's a lot of strategy and decision-making involved.
And then in the psychomotor domain, they'd be actually putting those skills into practice, developing hand-eye coordination, agility, and reaction time as they move around the court.
Exactly. They're honing those physical abilities and working on precision, control, and technique.
And we can't forget about the affective domain. In that volleyball unit, you'd also be fostering teamwork, communication, and a positive attitude towards the sport.
Right. You want to create a supportive environment where students feel comfortable trying new things and taking risks. It's about building their confidence and helping them develop a love for physical activity.
Absolutely. And it's also important to consider the physical domain. You'd be taking into account the student's individual physical development, ensuring the activities are appropriate for their strength, stamina, and coordination levels.
Precisely. You want to make sure everyone is challenged but not overwhelmed. It's about finding that sweet spot where they can push themselves and improve, but also feel successful and have fun.
Okay, and last but not least, there's the social-emotional domain, which seems especially important in a team sport like volleyball.
Absolutely. In volleyball, you'd be encouraging students to support each other, communicate effectively, celebrate successes, and learn from mistakes together.
It's about developing those essential social skills that help them navigate relationships and work effectively in teams.
Exactly. And those skills are transferable to so many different areas of their lives.
This is so eye-opening. It really highlights how PE is about so much more than just physical skill.
Right. It's about developing the whole child.
And I love how you use that volleyball unit as an example to show how all these different learning domains come together to create a truly holistic and engaging PE experience. It's about the cognitive, the psychomotor, the affective, the physical, and the social-emotional.
You got it. They're all interconnected.
This has been such a great start to our deep dive. We've covered so much ground already, but there's still so much more to explore when it comes to fair assessments in PE. Are you ready to continue the conversation?
Absolutely. I'm excited to see where this deep dive takes us.
All right, let's do it.
Let's go. So, one thing our source material mentions is that assessments in PE should happen, like, regularly.
Yeah, it emphasizes that point.
But why do you think that is?
Well, I guess it's about keeping track of progress, right? Like checking in to see how students are doing and making adjustments along the way.
Exactly. It's about creating this ongoing feedback loop, where you're constantly monitoring, adjusting, and guiding the learning process.
It's not just a one-time thing. It's integrated into the whole teaching process.
Right. It's not just about that single test at the end. It's about using assessment as a tool for learning and growth.
So are we talking about using a variety of methods here, not just formal tests, but also observations, checklists, conversations with students, all those things?
You got it. The more data you have, the better you understand where your students are at, and the better you can support them.
It's about being really intentional and observant, constantly looking for those opportunities to gather information about how students are learning.
And that brings us to another interesting topic, the use of self-assessments and peer assessments in PE.
Oh, yeah, I was curious about that. How can we actually use those types of assessments effectively in a PE setting? I can see how they might work in a traditional classroom, but in PE.
Right. It might seem a little trickier, but trust me, it's totally doable and incredibly valuable.
Okay, I'm listening.
So take self-assessments, for example. They can be a really powerful way to empower students. Help them take ownership of their learning.
Instead of just waiting for the teacher to tell them how they're doing, they're actively reflecting on their own performance.
Exactly. They're developing those metacognitive skills, thinking about their own thinking, which is so important for becoming lifelong learners.
Okay, I like where this is going, but what does that actually look like in a PE class? What would a self-assessment look like, for instance?
Okay, so picture this. Your students just finished practicing their basketball skills.
All right, basketball practice. Got it.
You could give them this rubric that outlines specific criteria for dribbling, passing, shooting.
Okay, a rubric with clear criteria.
Yeah, and they'd use that rubric to self-assess their own performance, identify their strengths, areas where they could improve.
They're using that clear criteria to evaluate themselves and becoming more aware of their own strengths and weaknesses.
Exactly. It's all about that self-reflection piece.
Okay, I can see how that would work. And what about peer assessments? Are those manageable in PE?
They can be really powerful if you do them right, because you're promoting collaboration, feedback, and support among the students.
So they're learning from each other and helping each other improve?
Exactly. Imagine your students are working on their volleyball serves.
Okay, volleyball serve.
They can pair up, observe each other, give each other constructive feedback, and offer suggestions.
They're practicing those communication skills. Learning how to give and receive feedback effectively.
And you're strengthening those bonds of teamwork and support in the process.
I'm really starting to see the value of these alternative assessment methods. It's about creating a more engaging learning environment where students are actively involved in their own assessment.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Okay, so much good stuff about assessments. But before we move on, I wanted to circle back to something we touched upon earlier, that idea of personality influencing sport preference.
Oh, yeah. That's always an interesting topic.
It is. What does our source material have to say about that?
Well, it suggests that there's often a correlation between personality traits and sport preferences. It's not a hard and fast rule, but often certain personalities might lean towards certain sports.
Like what? Can you give me an example?
Sure. Extroverted people, those who really thrive in social settings, they often gravitate toward team sports. Basketball, soccer, things like that.
Yeah, that makes sense. They get to be part of that group energy and interact with others.
Exactly. And what about introverts?
Yeah, what kinds of sports would they be drawn to?
Well, they often prefer individual sports. Things like swimming, tennis, maybe even archery.
So they can focus on their own performance and enjoy that sense of solitude.
Right. It's about finding what feels right for them.
That makes a lot of sense. People are drawn to activities that align with their natural personalities.
And as educators, it's our job to be aware of those differences and to create a PE environment where everyone feels comfortable and supported, regardless of their personality or preferences.
Exactly. We want to celebrate those differences and help every student find their own path to success.
Couldn't agree more. Now, before we wrap up, I wanted to bring up one more thing that stood out to me from the source material.
Oh, what's that?
It's the discussion about how a student's background knowledge and prior experiences can actually impact how well they do on those PE assessments.
Oh, yeah, that's a really important point. We can't assume that all students come to PE with the same level of experience or knowledge.
Right. A student who's grown up playing sports might have a huge advantage over a student who's never really been exposed to organized physical activity before.
Or a student who's had access to private swimming lessons versus a student who's never even been to a pool.
Exactly. Those differences in background can create an uneven playing field when it comes to assessments.
It's like expecting everyone to do well on a test about a topic they've never even heard of.
Right. It's just not fair. So as educators, we need to be mindful of that and make sure we're not penalizing students for things that are outside of their control.
Okay, so how do we address that? How do we level the playing field and make sure our assessments are truly equitable for all students, no matter their background?
Well, there are a few things we can do. First, we can use a variety of assessment methods, so we're not just relying on traditional skills tests, which can be heavily influenced by prior experience.
So things like projects, portfolios, presentations, those kinds of things.
Exactly. Give students different ways to show what they know. And another thing we can do is to make a real effort to build background knowledge before we assess students.
Okay, I like that. So if we're teaching a unit on basketball, for instance, we could start by showing videos of famous basketball players, or talking about the history of the sport, or even having students share their own personal experiences with basketball, no matter how limited they might be.
Right. Even if it's just playing a game with friends or family, just getting them thinking about the sport and building that foundational knowledge.
It's about creating a shared understanding and making sure everyone has a fair chance to succeed.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that fairness isn't just about the assessment itself. It's about creating that inclusive learning environment, where all students feel supported and empowered.
And I love how this conversation has really highlighted that PE is about so much more than just physical skills. It's about cognitive understanding, affective development, social emotional growth. All those things are interwoven.
It's about the whole child.
Yes, the whole child. Well, I don't know about you, but this conversation has been so incredibly insightful and thought-provoking.
It really has. It's making me think about my own teaching practice and how I can make my assessments even more fair and effective.
I'm feeling the same way. It's given me a lot to think about.
So as we wrap up this part of our discussion, I'd love to hear any final thoughts you might have and any key takeaways you want to leave our listeners with today.
All right, let's do that. Let's move on to our final thoughts for this deep dive.
Sounds good to me.
Okay, so let's shift gears now and move into those final thoughts for this deep dive into fair assessments in PE.
Sounds good to me.
So, reflecting on everything we've discussed today, what are some of the key takeaways that you hope our listeners will walk away with?
Well, I really hope that our listeners have gained a deeper understanding of just how complex assessment in PE really is.
Yeah, it's definitely more nuanced than people might think.
Right. And I think it's so important to move beyond that simplistic view of just measuring physical skills,
Mm.
you know. We need to be thinking about the whole child.
Exactly. Their cognitive abilities, their social and emotional development, their attitudes and values, it's all connected.
Absolutely. And I also hope that our listeners are feeling inspired to really think critically about their own assessment practices.
To challenge those traditional methods and maybe try some new and innovative approaches.
Yeah, exactly. There's always room for growth and improvement, you
Yeah.
know. And the more we learn about assessment, the better we can support our students.
Absolutely. And as we wrap up this episode, I want to make sure we leave our listeners with some practical takeaways.
Okay, I like that. Make it actionable.
Yeah. So, what are some specific things that PE teachers can do to make sure that their assessments are truly fair and equitable for all students?
All right. Well, first and foremost, I'd say go back and revisit those 4 key elements of fairness that we talked about earlier: validity, reliability, clarity, and freedom from bias.
Yeah. Right. Those are like the cornerstones of good assessment.
Exactly. Use them as guiding principles when you're designing any assessment, not just in PE, but in any subject.
Okay, those are great reminders. And, in addition to those 4 elements, I think it's also really important to remember that assessment should be an ongoing process, not just a one-time event.
Absolutely. It's about those regular check-ins, using both formal and informal methods, and always looking for opportunities to give students feedback.
Feedback that's specific, actionable, and encouraging.
Yes, exactly. And, don't be afraid to get creative with your assessment methods.
Explore those alternative approaches like self-assessments and peer assessments. They can be so powerful.
And remember to gather information from multiple sources.
Yeah. Go beyond just those test scores. Use observations, have conversations with your students, really get to know them as learners.
It's about building those relationships and creating a culture of feedback and support in your classroom.
And don't forget about those other learning domains that influence PE, like the cognitive, affective, and social emotional. Make sure your assessments are capturing the richness and complexity of the learning that's happening.
You got it. It's about assessing the whole child.
That's such a great way to put it. Assess the whole child. Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground today, and I'm feeling really energized and inspired by this conversation.
Me too. It's been a great deep dive.
So, as we wrap up this episode of The Deep Dive, a huge thank you to you for sharing your incredible knowledge and expertise with us today.
It's been my pleasure. I always love talking about this stuff.
And thank you to all of our listeners for joining us on this journey of exploration.
Thanks for listening, everyone.
We hope you found this deep dive informative and thought-provoking.
And we hope you'll join us again next time for another deep dive into the world of education.
Until then, keep those minds active, those bodies moving, and never stop learning.
Keep exploring.
Keep questioning.
And most importantly, keep striving to create those positive and empowering learning experiences for every student.
That's what it's all about. Thanks again for listening, everyone. Our